Morning. It's a beautiful day today. Good time to start a new project. Actually, this project got started when I was only 9 years old, although I certainly didn't realize it at the time. I have been writing off and on now, going on 40 years. And not your usual writing a novel or biography, but instead a compilation of thoughts and ideas that I've had over the years. And those thoughts and ideas have been garnered from a somewhat privileged and unconventional lifestyle. And although that may very well sound quite boastful, I certainly don't mean for it to be. In fact, most of the wonderful things that have happened in my life have not been because of any great brilliance on my part, but more on the brilliance of the people around me, starting with my parents, my teachers, professors, my partner, and a myriad of friendships. When I start out doing things on my own, I sometimes screw up quite badly. But I still end up okay. Let me give you an example. I go for my first job interview. It's 1967. I'm fresh out of college, have no idea what I want to do or be. But I get the idea, hey, why not join the airlines, travel for a few years until I can decide what I want to do. So at that time, what airline would you most want to work for? Well, Pan Am, World Airlines. So I get dressed to the nines. I go off to Pan Am, get my application, go in for my interview. Everything is going swimmingly until we get to question number 9. I remember that number because it had a rather profound effect on my future. Question number 9 was, what do you wish to do for Pan Am? And I had written down personnel. The interviewer called my attention to that, and I responded that, well, yes, ma'am, I really enjoy working with people. And she said, well, if you're going to work in personnel, you really should learn how to spell it. My heart sank to my ankles. The next thing I heard was this haughty Pan Am voice saying, I don't think we have any place for you here at Pan Am, but I understand Delta is hiring. Well, the irony of that is that Delta went on to become one of the most successful airlines in the industry, and Pan Am went out of business. That is how my life has been. My original intent for these writings was to put my thoughts on paper and then to publish anonymously. The reason I wanted to do that way was because I think once you know something about the author, you tend to categorize the author. You can take one look at me, the way I'm dressed, and the environment where I live, and say, oh, this guy is the quintessential conservative. Fiscally, you would be correct. But socially and politically, you couldn't be more wrong. My early years could not have been more comfortable or conventional. My mom was a stay-at-home housewife, but at the same time, quite a far thinker. For instance, when she married my dad back in the 40s, and it was determined that she was going to be a stay-at-home housewife and do the cooking and take care of the kids. If that was to be her job, she was determined that she was going to be paid for that job. So my dad, back in the 40s, paid my mom for her entire life. A bit unconventional. So while she was very far thinking about things like that, she was also devout Catholic. Where Catholicism was concerned, she never had a thought of her own regarding Catholicism. She had faith, and that was it. I remember as a small kid, we would always, my brother and I would always say our prayers at bedtime. And we would say the usual things, but always at some point during the prayers, my brother and I would say, "Thank you, God, for bringing Daddy home from Okinawa. And please make him Catholic." The irony of that is that decades after I lost my own religion, my dad converted to Catholicism. I think God had a good chuckle over that at my expense. Anyway, my dad was a nominal Protestant and a very successful businessman, and as you might imagine, a Republican. My brother and I had quite an easy, wonderful life. We didn't even have to think about anything. We both knew that we would grow up to be Catholic Republicans. But all of this very comfortable existence for me came crashing down when I was only 9 years old. What happened to me at that age caused me to lose my religion. And within a year after that, I was questioning my conservative background. The situation got so bad that I actually contemplated suicide. I'm a kid. I'm not even 10 years old, well, just 10 years old, and contemplating suicide. No kid should have to go through that. But more on that later. So for now, I want to stop the chatter and get on with what this is supposed to be, which is a venue for my writing. Now, any writing needs a good title. And the one I've chosen goes along with my rather unconventional lifestyle. The title of my work is Hooray for Cannibals, Agnostics, and the Filthy Rich. A bit odd, but all to be explained. Now, since my writings are a compilation of thoughts, ideas, they could be in any particular order. I have chosen God to be chapter 1, simply because many of us think that this is where it all began, was with God. So I give you chapter 1, God. So chapter 1, simply God. I have absolutely no idea whether or not there is a God. I do know, however, that were there not a God, man would create one. This, in fact, can be proven by the fact that throughout history, man has always created God. Caveman had the god of the hunt. Jews have their God, and Christians have a different version of that same God. Meanwhile, the Muslims have Allah, the Buddhists have their Buddha, and the Greeks and the Romans had gods of every description. None of this in any way excludes the possibility that there is a God. It simply indicates that we cannot know him, or people from different eras and different civilizations would all come up with the same conclusions. It is always the current civilization which thinks only previous gods were created by man. If the Christian era had preceded the Greek and Roman era, the Greeks and the Romans would have studied Christian mythology. Once man has created his God, he then touts faith as the ultimate achievement, thus ensuring the continuum of that God, which in reality faith does is stop in its tracks the brain with which man was endowed and separates him from those who found a different God, which in fact is not what God wants. Supposedly, God wants us to love one another and not be separated from each other. I dare to suggest that man is both conceited yet insecure, and that he detests not knowing. The unknown frightens him, and what greater or scarier unknown than the afterlife? So, man creates a god or gods, empowers them, establishes rules to appease them, creates a marvelous afterlife, and then seals it all up with faith so that no one has to query it any further. It is all there in black and white. But if there are so many different answers out there, how do we know that the faith we are upholding is the ultimate one? My poor mother, bless her soul, was quite convinced if she was born in Israel to Jewish parents that she would somehow still be Roman Catholic. Sorry, Mother, it simply does not work that way. Your faith is an accident of birth. You are Catholic because your mother was Catholic and her mother before her. And you are not to question religion because faith is exalted as something so sacred as to be worth dying for. Few ever bother to question the faith of their ancestors, but rather embrace that faith with such fervor as to cause war with those who believe otherwise. And history repeats itself. Chapter 2. In God we trust. In God we trust. Are you kidding? The entity, or whatever you wish to call it, supposedly created the world. He had all eternity to do that and get it right. Instead, he chose to do this little project in just 7 days. As a result, his creation has earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, fires, droughts, and tsunamis. He then populated this sad creation with Adam and Eve and tells them not to eat of the forbidden fruit. Now, God knew that curiosity killed the cat, but did he tell Adam and Eve the consequences of eating that fruit? He could have created Adam and Eve any way he wanted. Why did he not create them to be more obedient? And thus, mankind could have had peace and love throughout eternity. To my way of thinking, that is not what a good and loving God would have done. My mom taught my brother and I that there is no such thing as bad children, only bad parents. So, if God didn't teach his creations properly, and his offspring ate the forbidden fruit, then really, who is to blame? And since God is supposedly all-knowing, he knew that his offspring would eat that fruit. As a result of this inadequate education, he kicks his own kids out of paradise and forces them to endure the atrocities that he just created. Not only that, but this entity passes this judgment to all heirs forevermore. All this because his kids ate an apple off a tree. This is the God I am supposed to trust? But wait, it gets worse. Adam and Eve's kids are so hostile that there is murder and incest in the very first generation. But what can you expect with such close inbreeding? Who else could Adam and Eve's offspring have intercourse with except their siblings? There was no one else around. If you are to believe the story of creation, you have to think that we are all, to some point, a little bit bonkers. Not saying yay or nay, but things get so bad that after a period of time, there is only one good family left on earth. So, God, in his infinite mercy, tells Noah to build an ark and populate it with 2 of all God's creatures. Not certain just how the kangaroos and koala bears got to the ark, but they did. All that being accomplished, the floods came, and God began the task of systematically drowning all the rest of the animals and human life. And this is the entity I am supposed to look up to, respect, and trust? Still not finished. More time passes. Finally, good arrives in the form of Jesus Christ, whose only crime was to love everything and everybody. And what punishment does he receive for this crime? He gets to suffer and die on the cross in order to placate his Father. What good father gets his jollies from seeing his son suffer and die? I don't get it. So, how can I be so irreverent and blasphemous? Please see previous chapter. I am not being irreverent and blasphemous. I am simply saying that the God I see in Genesis does not appear to be a loving God, and by most widely accepted definition, God is love. So, I am not being blasphemous to the God which may or may not exist, but simply irreverent to the God who man created. Chapter 3, Abraham and Isaac. This is one of my favorites from the Bible. In Genesis 22, we are told that God tests Abraham by telling him to take his only son Isaac and sacrifice him as a burnt offering, and Abraham agrees. I have heard it preached that Abraham was a great man because he did not question God. Is there a single father out there who would actually slay his own son because some voice from the heavens told him to do so? Did anyone check with Isaac what he thought about being tied up and burnt to death by his own father? Abraham was high on pot, and he should have been imprisoned for life for child endangerment. Instead, Abraham is touted as some wonderful historic figure and preached from the pulpit as to his goodness. He was on drugs. He should have been imprisoned, not exalted. The Bible is full of flaws, and the clergy, who teach can be flawed, and the people who adhere to every word of the Bible as the only word of God, while other religions continue to think their religious writings are the word of God. We shall continue to have irreparable conflict and divisiveness. The Bible is a good book, but it is not infallible. Let's lighten up for a bit and go to birthdays. Christmas at our home was always nothing short of incredible. And for weeks prior to Christmas, there was the buying of presents or making gifts and going to see light displays and then Christmas Eve itself arrives and there was always both sets of grandparents, and there was always at least one outsider from rest home or something that had nowhere to go on Christmas. And then Santa Claus would appear. In our house, Santa Claus did not just put presents under the tree and leave. No, Santa Claus arrived at our home, and my brother and I were both expected to play the piano for him. And of course we played very well because we figured that that would be how we received the best gifts. Anyway, although Christmas was incredible, birthdays, if I got a toothbrush for my birthday, I was doing well. So, birthdays. Growing up, I, like most kids, thought parents had some pretty weird ideas. I especially thought my mom's notion about birthdays was totally off the wall. Not until well into adulthood did I realize that my mom was the only one who got it right. On this one, I have to give her all the credit. The way things are done now is that on one's date of birth, a child is showered with gifts for having existed for another year. Somehow, the birthday person is supposedly entitled to annual gifts for having done absolutely nothing. What about the woman who suffered for 9 months for you, who went through excruciating pain to bring you into the world, and then spent your early years changing your diapers, cooking your meals, and making one sacrifice after another so that you could have a better life? Birthdays, my dear readers, should be the date you show your mom just how much you appreciate all that she does for you. If a mom has 6 kids, she should have 6 birthdays. And each of those kids should be in competition with each other, vying to see who could do the most for his or her mom. It should be a time for an offspring to be taught love, respect, appreciation, and never a time for entitlement. Every day is Kids' Day. Birthdays should be Mother's Day. Chapter 5, Abortion. Has ever a subject stirred such emotion and loathing as the subject of abortion? Because the emotion is so vehement, both sides think in terms only of absolutes, while a step back for a more detached look at the issue would serve both sides to understand that absolutes simply cannot work. The pro-choice faction has got to realize, while fighting for their own rights, that blatant and callous disregard for the rights of the unborn does little to endeavor them to the opposition. Meanwhile, the pro-lifers must realize that their circumstances are often quite different from those of the opponents, and that judging someone from different circumstances is reprehensible, not only from the standpoint of common sense, but from the standpoint of morality as well. In fact, the religious right needs to be reminded about judge not, lest ye be judged. Furthermore, the pro-life forces must face the fact that no amount of legislation is going to put an end to abortion, nor are the negative protests. Negativism has never gotten any campaign anywhere. The religious right would do more good using their enormous energy and resources towards efforts to prevent unwanted pregnancy and offering better alternatives. The right would also do well to realize that the only people who really have any right to be totally against abortion are Christian Scientists, because only they are against extending life. How can you be for extending life and against shortening it? In both cases, you are playing God. It may sound from this that I am in favor of abortion. Actually, I am vehemently opposed to it and hold that life begins at inception. That does not mean, however, that I am against a woman's right to choose. We all need to become more responsible for ourselves and our own decisions and lay off the conclusions of others. Chapter 6, Cannibalism. Granted, cannibalism is not exactly a hot-button issue these days. However, there is much to be learned from the way the outside world dealt with this issue. For centuries, the people of New Guinea have eaten their ancestors and those killed in battle in order not just to have the meat their diet solely needs, but in order to honor the departed. Mind you, they did not kill in order to eat, but merely to eat when death occurred. Now that may seem a bit odd to our culture, and I am not suggesting that we have grandma for breakfast. But we must remember that a man walking on water or a virgin given birth would be ludicrous to the people of New Guinea. However, as most religions tend to do, the Christians figured their way was the right way, and in came the missionaries and the government and put a stop to cannibalism. Well, if we examine this, what we were teaching these people was waste. Why not bury the dead so the worms could eat rather than partake of such needed nourishment the population needed? From this perspective, who is at fault here? I might point out further that a culture fraught with rape, incest, fornication, divorce, and other perversions should hardly be teaching people for whom love is innate that they need to cover their tits and testicles. Never in all my travels have I found a happier group of people. What I found lacking in their culture was two things: God and possessions. When are we going to understand that we need to learn from other cultures, not destroy them, so there is nothing left to learn? Frankly, during my visit to New Guinea, nothing would have made me happier than seeing those loathsome Aborigines garnering down a few missionaries. That's all for today. I look forward to seeing you again. Good morning again. Another beautiful day. Where we left off last time was the subject of cannibalism. And I figured if anybody came back after that, I was probably free to go. So, to continue, Chapter 7, Freedom of Speech, Truth in Advertising. I have often stressed over how easy it is to milk the unsuspecting from their finances. The elderly and less educated are particularly vulnerable. Perpetrators are ruthless, and even churches are not without suspect. On the other hand, I must totally support free speech. Thus, we have the seemingly insurmountable dilemma of allowing free speech, but not allowing false advertising. Suddenly, it dawned on me. I realized that at any time money is exchanged, the speech is no longer free. So, while I generally do not support much government involvement, in this case, I believe the government owes the people some degree of regulation to protect them against non-supported claims by paid advertising. Chapter 8, A Most Intriguing Gentleman. During my working years in New York, I had the distinct good fortune of living on the Upper West Side and working on the East Side. The most direct route was to simply walk through Central Park. What a wonderful way to start every day, watching the seasons change while walking through Frederick Olmsted's magnificent creation in one of the finest cities on earth. It was heaven. Because of working shift schedules, I gradually got to know the park from dawn to dusk. Back then, I had no fear of walking home even at midnight. I saw how the park woke up and how it went to sleep. I learned what animals would be out when, and most importantly, I also learned where the homeless inhabitants of the park dwelled. There was one particular homeless man who often caught my eye. What fascinated me about him was the fact that he was forever reading the newspaper, and his favorite newspaper seemed to be the Wall Street Journal. Gradually, I started to give him a cheery hello on my way to work, and then I started heading to work early just so I could have a wee conversation en route. Turns out this fellow was extremely well-educated and well-spoken. There wasn't a subject he couldn't discuss in detail and often had incredible insights. I grew more and more fascinated, and our talks became longer and longer. The fact that he had quite a fine British accent made him even more intriguing. Although he could discuss any topic, there was one topic that was totally off limits, and that was anything about himself. In all the years I knew him, not once could I encourage him to open up about himself. There was no bitterness, no unkindness towards anyone, no talk of family or friends. It was the life he chose, and he made no apologies for it. As the years passed, the hardships of homelessness took its toll, and I could tell that dementia was setting in. Eventually, he no longer recognized me, and after one particularly hard winter, I never saw him again. There was an emptiness in me after that. I was so glad to have known such a vibrant and intriguing human being. You never know whom you might meet in life. Chapter 9, Opinion. Everyone's opinion is more important than your own. It is a simple truth, and here is why. There is an old adage about the fact that you learn nothing while speaking, or, to put it another way, you only learn from listening. Therefore, if you want to learn, listen intently to another's opinion. You already know your own opinion. Don't be quick to give another your opinion, as you already know that. Don't spend your time figuring out how to defend your opinion. Instead, delve into the reasons for another's opinion. Help him to express his views. The person you are sparring with will appreciate your efforts and will then be far more akin to listening to what you have to say once he is convinced you have made every effort to understand what he has said. You want to win an argument? Don't argue. It's the one time in life where it's okay to be selfish. Whole wars could be avoided if both sides tried first to figure out where the other was coming from. Chapter 10, Suicide. This one totally eludes me. In this country, it is okay to abort a fetus, thereby removing its right to live. But it is not okay for a man to make a decision about his own right to die. A doctor can kill the unborn with impunity, but if he attempts to help a fellow human being suffering from some unbearable cancer, he can be imprisoned for life. What business is it of anyone else what someone does with his own life? Kevorkian was a saint. Chapter 11, the President. It is truly unfortunate that I must acknowledge that I am not particularly a Trump supporter before proceeding with this chapter, or else half my readers would immediately stop reading, which, in fact, already proves the point I am about to make. Donald Trump has been called the most divisive president in history. Perhaps. But if you stop for a moment, step back and evaluate, approximately half of the country voted for him. The other half of the country disagrees with virtually everything he does. So, is it the Donald who is divisive, or those who refuse to support him even though he was elected to office? For most of my life, no matter who got elected, no matter which side they were on, you stood behind that president for 4 years. It was the American way. The people had spoken. In recent elections, for the first time, I am hearing, quote, "He's not my president. I didn't vote for him." What a terrible precedent is being set. He is your president for 4 years. And if you are unhappy with the outcome, I suggest that you have 4 years in which to alter the next outcome. And I suggest you do it without guns and tyranny. Perhaps it is the aisle which separates Democrats from Republicans. Why is it such a big deal when something is bipartisan? Why shouldn't every vote be bipartisan? Perhaps party affiliation should be abolished and each congressman be voted upon based solely on his record and not his affiliation. When I go to the voting booth, I want to vote for an individual, not a party. No more would a member of a particular party be censored for not voting along party lines. I, for one, applaud such an individual. We could then have constructive conversation rather than heated debate, and constant negative criticism could be replaced with positive suggestions. Hooray for the current president, whoever he or she may be. Now let's return to my favorite subject, religion. Chapter 12, Infallibility. Infallibility? Again, you have to be kidding. Infallibility is the notion the Catholic Church has promulgated, stating that in matters of faith and morals, it could make no mistake and should not be questioned. First off, anyone can declare anything they like, but that doesn't make it so. King Louis XIV declared himself the Sun King, but that did not give him divine right. The doctrine of infallibility was introduced into the Church during the First Vatican Council in 1870. The Church had gotten along without infallibility for nearly 2,000 years, and I cannot help question by what infallible doctrine the Church suddenly became infallible. Furthermore, faith and morals isn't the whole story. It's just the part of the teachings the Church wants you to know so that they can keep control over the congregates. The rest of the story, the part that it fails to mention, is that the Church claims infallibility in matters of faith and morals only when it speaks ex cathedra, meaning only when it specifically states that it is speaking infallibly. Because, as a good Catholic kid, I believed totally that for being gay, I would spend eternity in the everlasting fire. That was, after all, what I had been taught. And without the ex-cathedral part of the story, I more than once contemplated suicide. More on this later. Is it any wonder my hatred of the Catholic Church is so severe? And by the way, in the 150 years since introducing infallibility, it has, to the best of my knowledge, been exercised only one time. That was in 1950, when the Church claimed the Virgin Mary was assumed into heaven. Chapter 13, Miracles. Christ's first miracle was the wedding feast at Cana. A very good story, and a miracle indeed, but not in the way we were taught. Since weddings at that time could go on for days, it would not be unusual for wine to run out. Noticing that, Mary asked Christ to do something, which indeed he did. Sorry to break it to all you believers out there, but Christ did not change water into wine. He got together with his disciples, went off to the local wine merchant, and brought the wine back to the celebration. And he did this without telling anyone, and thus making it appear to be a miracle. Fact of the matter is that it was a miracle. It was the miracle of love. Isn't this a much better story from which to learn? None of us can turn water into wine, but we can help others and do it anonymously. So, how do I know what happened at Cana 2,000 years ago? Obviously, I don't, but my interpretation is just as valid as the silly priest who thought it a better story if it were full of hocus pocus. Then there is the miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes to feed the multitude. Again, no doubt a miracle, but not the way we are told. It may be perfectly true that Christ had only 5 loaves and 2 fishes. But when he started distributing indiscriminately what little he had, and the crowd saw this, they started sharing amongst each other what little they had. And thus the multitude was fed. Again, a miracle, but the miracle of love, of giving, not the hocus pocus we are taught. So feel free to interpret the miracle as you deem fit, but I like my way best. I'd rather teach the importance of sharing than pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And then there was walking on water. Come on. There was a storm brewing, mist from the land lapping the waves. Christ was probably standing on a sandbar, and so naturally it could appear he was walking on water. I bet he had a good laugh out of that. After all, he was human, you know. And since he was a kind and loving man, he never told the disciples what occurred. Yep, another miracle. Chapter 14, Celibacy. Is it any wonder there is so much child molestation in the Catholic Church? Child molestation occurs in every church, in every culture, but why such prevalence in Catholicism? The simple answer is the doctrine of celibacy. Think about it. At the very height of his sexual prowess, a man is asked to surrender his natural instincts and give up not only his sexuality, but all physical connection with another human being, and to do that for a lifetime. Anyone accepting such stupidity has got to be at least a little bit mad. Unfortunately, having been taught since childhood that sex outside of marriage, and especially homosexual sex, is direct passage to the eternal fires of hell, the poor bloke thinks perhaps he can hide his feelings within an institution which glorifies the withdrawal of natural instinct. That, dear reader, would be called Catholicism. This madness may last for a time, but eventually the lack of physical connection raises its head, and the poor priest is far too often tempted beyond his own strengths. And what does the church do when this travesty occurs? Well, for most of its history, it simply swept the problem under the rug. More recently, due finally to the coming forth of the countless youths who suffered molestation at the hands of these unfortunate priests, the church finally took action. Yes, the new policy includes asking young men who have been called to the priesthood about their sexuality. By eliminating homosexuals from the priesthood, we are assured of a ministry free of molestation. The stupidity continues. Chapter 15, Marriage Vows. Till death do us part. Again, got to be kidding. Tell me that in your 20s, you are going to make a commitment to last a lifetime? Nice romantic idea, and I am definitely a romantic, but here are the facts. People change. I am certainly not the same person I was in my 20s. Sometimes people grow and change in the same direction. Sometimes they grow in different directions, but they do change. The very fact that more than 50% of marriages in the U.S. end in divorce is proof positive that a lifetime commitment made by such youth may not be a great idea. Vows can and should change. When was the last time you heard a bride state that she would love, honor, and obey? That vow has changed, and why shouldn't it? Strange as it may seem, how about, instead of till death do us part, how about till we get the kids through college do we part? Kids need a warm, loving, and stable home in which to grow. But how often have you heard unhappy couples state that they stay together for the kids? Meanwhile, the unhappy couple argues and presents an environment kids should never see. If the couple feels they need to stay together the rest of their lives, the situation continues to fester. But if there is a reasonable timeline set, the couple may be much better able to achieve that goal in a civilized manner. Meanwhile, the couple who have grown together can renew their vows with "till death do us part." How romantic is that? How on earth do I come up with these outrageous ideas which nevertheless seem to make sense? I have no idea. Chapter 16, the Bible. Christians like to speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition. It gives them a sense of continuum. But have you ever heard a Jew speak of the Judeo-Christian tradition? Of course not. There's no such thing. Basic to Judaism is the hope of a Savior. Basic to Christianity is the belief that the Savior has already arrived in the form of Jesus Christ. How different can two beliefs be? Furthermore, the God of the Old Testament is a revengeful God, an eye for an eye, while the God of the New Testament is supposedly a loving God. Again, no correlation. The New Testament was written nearly 2,000 years ago, and the Old Testament way before that. The New Testament is basically about the life of Christ and about Christ until some 40 years after his death. So dialogues about his childhood and teachings are hearsay at best. And even writings of his death and resurrection are 40 years hence, and written by men who had no personal knowledge of him. So there is still plenty of room for error, omission, misinterpretation, and so on. Furthermore, the New Testament was written in Greek and Aramaic, and then translated into Latin before further translation into English. From there, scholars and teachers put their slant on things before passing their knowledge on to the congregation. And the congregation itself accepts those teachings with their own slant. My point? Even if you accept that somehow God inspired those writings of 2,000 years ago, do keep in mind that they were written down, translated, retranslated, selected, taught, retaught, and then passed on as gospel truth to a congregation unsuspecting that by the time it got to them, the message could be quite different from the original, even though it is taught as gospel truth. And speaking of gospel truth, I am certain that you have had the Gospels read from the pulpit and concluded with the word of the Lord. If, however, you read the Gospels concurrently, you find discrepancies in the teachings. How can there be discrepancies if it is the word of the Lord? Besides, the Bible is not the only book said to have been inspired by God. The Quran was recited to Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. And the Mormons claim the Book of Mormon was inspired, proven by golden plates. So, what am I trying to say? Basically, the truth is that the Bible is no more or no less credible than the Quran or the Book of Mormon. This last chapter reminds me of my favorite joke. There was this young man in France who was of an age that he needed to decide what he was going to do with his life. And he was a very religious man. And he had been thinking for some time that he would like to become a monk, join a monastery. And there was this one particular monastery that he had heard about that was world-renowned for copying the sacred texts and embellishing them with artwork and so on. And he thought this seemed like a very good idea. So he packed his little satchel and went off to this monastery way up in the hills. And he was greeted with open arms and welcoming, and they gave him a lovely dinner and showed him the gardens and so forth and so on. And so the very next day, he was shown his desk, and the life work that he was to do began. And he was quite happy in what he was doing. He thought this was very, very worthwhile. And this continued for months. Then, one morning, he started thinking, if we continue to copy one text from another, maybe at some point there had been some miscopying, some misinterpretation, whatever. And so his idea was that maybe at some point we need to go back to the original text, just make sure everything was copacetic. So he took this idea to the head abbot, and the abbot received this very well and decided this was a wonderful idea, and actually important enough that he was going to take this project on himself. So he goes down to his cell and has all the original texts brought down to his cell, and starts the momentous project of making sure that all of the texts are proper. So months pass, everything seems to be okay, and then all of a sudden, one day, he doesn't show up for morning prayers, and he doesn't show up for meals. And after the evening meal, the monks started to be very concerned about him, so they went down the stairs to the abbot's cell, and as they were descending, they heard this terrible, terrible sobbing. So they rushed into his cell, and they said, Brother, what's wrong? And the abbot looks up at them with these tears rolling down his cheeks, and it says, the word is celebrate. More next time. Bye now. Good morning once again. Welcome back. Chapter 17, Internal Conflict. If you say with certainty that you know there is a God, or that the Catholic Church is the one true church, or whatever, and you have even a smidgen of doubt, are you not then breaking the commandment of thou shalt not bear false witness? Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. As a young child growing up, I knew with certainty all that Catholicism taught. After all, the Church is infallible. Thinking back, did I really know, or simply deceive myself knowing what I was supposed to believe? Agnosticism allows for doubt. Chapter 18, Jesus gay? ? Well, I'm not suggesting that he was, but why not? Based on the fact that Jesus was 32 years old, Jewish, and unmarried at the time of his death, it has been suggested that Jesus may have been gay. I neither accept nor reject that view, but wish to point out that Jesus wasn't exactly the norm at the time, going off preaching at the temple when he was just a lad, and treating everyone the same without prejudice. And the Last Supper, what was all that about? 13 guys gathered together on the night before his death. Where are the wives? Where was Mary and Joseph? Guess it was hard to come out to one's parents back then also. I doubt there was a lot of gay venues in Jerusalem at the time, but perhaps the Last Supper was the first recorded gay bar. Who knows? Chapter 19, World Religion and Agnosticism. There are many estimates regarding the ranking of various world religions. However, it is generally accepted that Christianity, at approximately 2.4 billion or 33% of the population, places it at the top of the leaderboard, followed by Islam at 1.8 billion or 21%. However, if you divide Christianity into Catholic and Protestant, Catholicism becomes number 2 after Islam, and there are so many Protestant religions that none of them rank at all. Catholicism then ranks about the same as non-religious, including atheists and agnostics. Hinduism is further down the line, and Buddhism is well behind Hinduism. Although incredibly influential in terms of population, Judaism is barely mentionable. Does all this tell you anything? It tells me that if we could know the existence of God, then we would all have come up with the same answers regarding him. Instead, we come up with one religion after another, most claiming to be the true authority, and even claiming the Word of God, Holy Scripture, to be proof positive that their way is the true way. The Jews have the Torah, and the Christians have the New Testament. Believers in Islam have the Quran, and the Mormons have the Book of Mormon, all claiming to be the Word of God. No matter what religion we choose, 2/3 of the world believes differently. And to die for that religion is the single most direct passage to heaven. I grew up staunch Catholic. I believed everything. I believed the Catholic Church was the one true church. I believed there were 3 persons and one God. I believed in the virgin birth and in transubstantiation. I believed in limbo and the resurrection and the assumption of Mary. I believed in miracles. Little did I sort out that my mom got her knowledge from her mom, and her mom's mom got it from her mom, etc. After all, these truths were told by parents and priests, loving adults who ought to know. Not until puberty, when nature ran afoul of religion, did I finally come to realize that religion was created by man, not by God, because if there was a God, he could not be in conflict with the nature he purportedly created. I don't know if God created man, but I know positively that man created God. Man had to create God. How else could he have dealt with death? He had to know what happened at death. Unfortunately, all these religions so created came in conflict with each other. Many of them, assured that theirs was the true way, became convinced to inflict their truths on others. Religions which were supposedly to embrace love instead led to hostility and war. Agnostics admit not knowing. How humbling. And how much better if we could all be more humble. How exciting not to know. How exciting to be able to look to death as the next adventure and not something to be feared. Chapter 20, Taxes and the Rich. I can think of only 2 groups of people who should pay no tax, and those are the unemployed, who are willing to work, and the disabled, who are unable to work. The rest of us should be thankful for the good fortune to be able to pay taxes and to help the less fortunate. Even the poorest among us needs to pay taxes so that they feel part of the system. And the whole idea of entitlement has got to be reversed. The only things we are entitled to is equal opportunity. And if or when something within our society restricts that equality, then we need to address the problem post-haste and fix it immediately. It is opportunity which has made this country great. Meanwhile, our politicians vilify the wealthy for having made the cardinal sin of using their opportunity to become successful. They go on ad infinitum about the injustice of tax loopholes for the rich. But guess who those loopholes originated with? They originated in Congress by the very politicians who are now railing the rich for those loopholes. Furthermore, the billionaires of today represent a minuscule part of the population. Instead of thinking about how much more one can get out of these few, think about how much revenue these few generate. The super rich employ people, usually lots and lots of people, and these employees pay taxes. In addition, the rich buy mega yachts and private jets and huge homes, but guess what? Those jets and homes and yachts are built by working people, employed people, people who pay taxes. They are people who may be using their opportunity to become rich themselves. So instead of vilifying the rich, why not respect them for the enormous amount of good they do for the country? Instead of vilifying the rich for using tax loopholes, why not vilify the politicians who put those loopholes into the system? Lastly, though I think we should all do our fair share and that we should not tax the rich disproportionately, I think death wealth should pass to the spouse tax-free, but not the same to children. Passing wealth on to children gives them opportunity not afforded to all, and therefore is not analogous with equal opportunity. Chapter 21, prison. Now, if you want to skip any chapter, this would be the one to do, because I have absolutely no idea what I am talking about. But there's a reason why I have written this, and I think this will be explained. Chapter 21, prison. Where is there a place one's basic housing, furniture, heat, and air conditioning are provided free of charge? A place where 3 meals a day are prepared for you without any effort on your part. Where a health club is provided in time for its use guaranteed, and medical needs similarly provided and all free of charge. Sounds like it could be called nirvana, but instead it's called prison. Just do the most heinous of crimes and be rewarded with a life of leisure, living out your days in air-conditioned comfort with no worries about medical insurance or from whence your next meal was coming. Prison reform? I'm all for it. What prompted my interest in reform was a television documentary I saw many years ago. One of the things which totally blew me away was the incredible cost of keeping a man incarcerated. Perhaps what I propose is totally naive. I'm sure it is. But since the present system seems not to be working, perhaps any alternative suggestion deserves consideration. I think every prisoner on every level should have to earn his basic keep, that is, cell space and food. This can be done through working in the prison kitchen or garden or workshop, making anything for the general good, such as license plates or items to be sold in the prison store. Once he has met his minimum upkeep, he can reap additional rewards like cigarettes, movies, carpeting, larger cell, whatever, by working additional hours, just like in the real world. Okay, so I'm naive to think we are going to get some hardened criminal to work in the garden. I am against the death penalty, but I am not against suicide. See previous chapter. Let me explain. Suppose a hardened criminal has been given the death sentence. My suggestion is that he be given life in prison with the full written, signed, documented understanding that should he not comply with the prison system, his death sentence would be carried out. The death sentence would already have been given, but the carrying out of the sentence would be up to the prisoner, thereby becoming suicide. And who would decide? Why, a jury of his peers, of course. Fellow inmates, prison guards, etc., just like in the real world. Lesser criminals would be more likely rather be working in the garden than wasting away in their cells. But if they misbehave outside the cells and cause problems with other inmates or guards, punishment could be handed out again by their peers, just like in the real world. Chapter 22, Printing Money. Would someone please explain to me? Suicide is sometimes defined as a short-term answer to a long-term question. Our government's continuing to print money seems like financial suicide. There are a lot of financial wizards out there on both sides of the fence who think in opposite directions on this matter. Would someone please try to explain to me both sides in a way that is at least reasonably understandable? Chapter 23, COVID-19. No doubt, COVID-19 is worldwide punishment for all those who thought HIV was punishment for homosexuality. No, I'm not serious, but you do get the point. So before we continue on with the final chapters of my writing, I wanted to share something very personal with you. And that is the story of my coming out to my parents. This is often very traumatic for a gay kid or adult or whatever. And I certainly fought it for a long time. I wanted to come out with them at age 9. But if there's a God, I thank him for not letting that happen. Because I had wonderful parents, but they would have done the right thing at the time. And the right thing at the time was electric shock therapy. It was psychiatrists telling you how to get over being gay instead of accepting it. So I'm very pleased that I waited until much later. In fact, I was 50 years old when I finally came out to my parents. And I decided the way I wanted to do this was, I'm not very good on my feet doing extemporaneous. So, as with my other writings, I decided I was going to write my parents a letter. And not that I was going to stick that letter in the mail and let them read it on their own. I presented the letter to them. And this is that letter. Dear folks, it is April 1994, and I address this letter to my dear parents with not the slightest inkling as to whether or not I will ever give it to them. Somehow, though, I feel a necessity of putting on paper what it is I want to say. There is something in my life that I have wished to share with you for more than 40 years. The reason for wanting to share it with you back then has changed totally from the reason I still wish to share it with you today. What hasn't changed in all those years is the reason why I haven't been able to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you then, and I certainly don't want to hurt you now. I love my parents more than I could ever express. I feel certain that your initial reaction to this information will be of enormous hurt, and for that I am intensely sorry. But if I felt that the long-term result would not be positive, I know I would never tell you. If I find I have been wrong in that judgment, it is then something I will regret for the rest of my life. And all I can do is hope for forgiveness for ever having brought it to light. In my wildest imagination, I cannot believe that you don't already know what it is I'm going to tell you. But what you couldn't possibly know is the story behind it. And it is that story which I hope and believe can change your initial hurt into something very good and very positive. So, it is with considerable trepidation that I proceed with something it has taken me 40 years to do. I ask only that you don't let your initial reaction so overshadow what I have to say that you fail to hear anything beyond that initial statement. For your own sake, as well as mine, please listen to the whole story. The part of the story I can't believe you don't already know is the fact that I am gay. The part of the story you couldn't possibly know begins with the fact that I have been gay since I was 9 years old. What happened to me at that age was nothing sordid, nothing even unusual. It is quite normal when young boys are growing up to go out behind the barn and smoke a cigarette. And when they reach puberty, it is not unusual for them to go behind the barn and experiment with this strange thing happening to their bodies. Well, the other boys experimented and then went back to playing baseball and growing up, quote, normal. With me, however, I knew immediately that I was different, and I didn't like it one bit. In fact, it totally terrified me. Even at that young age, I had heard the terrible things my parents and their acquaintances said about homosexuals, the awful jokes, and how terribly wrong it was. And although that bothered me a great deal, what bothered me most was how wrong it was according to the church. I felt in my own heart that I would spend eternity in the fires of hell. That is a very real image for a young child to have to deal with, and I just didn't know what to do about it, whom to talk to, or where to go for help. My first reaction was to go to my parents. I already knew their feelings about homosexuals, but I also knew my folks felt there was no such thing as a bad kid, only bad parents. Well, I knew my parents weren't bad. And I certainly didn't want to hurt them. Besides, I didn't know what, if anything, they could do for me anyway. It was bad enough to cause my parents pain, but to do so needlessly might not be able to help anyway. No, I couldn't even think about that. So, whom else could I talk to? I thought about the family doctor. Now that made perfect sense. A doctor certainly should know what to do. So I called the doctor's office, and what a humiliation that was. Here I was with this very man-sized problem, and the nurse asks, "Does your mommy know that you're making this appointment?" Anyway, I persevered and got an appointment for after school the next day. That night, I didn't sleep a minute. I worried about what was in store for me. Then, in the middle of the night, two things dawned on me. First, what was I going to pay the doctor with? My weekly allowance? But more importantly, since I was a minor, might the doctor go to my parents? I couldn't risk hurting them. So the next day, I called and canceled the appointment. So who was left that I could talk to? Fortunately, there was the priest. Again, I thought, a priest ought to know and what to do, and more importantly, I knew that under the seal of confession, the priest couldn't reveal my terrible secret. So that is what I did. The priest was very shocked indeed. But what to do about it? Just pray, he said. God will answer your prayers. I had already been praying. If that were the answer, I knew I had to step up my efforts. Remember when I was a kid, how I used to set up altars on my chest of drawers in the bedroom? You probably thought, what a good little boy. I set up those altars because I thought I was the worst kid who had ever lived. I was so alone. I desperately hated myself and what was happening to me. Fortunately, my parents had taught me one particularly important lesson, and it is one that may even have saved my life. That lesson was that God helps those who help themselves. Prayer was fine, but I had to do more. What more could I do? I could read. I could go to the library and study and find out what causes this thing and what to do about it. Off I went. First to the school library. There was absolutely nothing. At the public library, I got every magazine, every newspaper article, every book on psychology, sociology, philosophy, and religion that ever mentioned homosexuality. I read and I studied everything. And when I exhausted the public library, I went on to the college library. You thought I was going to become a librarian? No. I didn't tell her why. But I had my aunt teach me to read the card files and how to locate books, and then off I went. I had to sneak the books out of the library, and I couldn't return them for fear of getting caught. Thus, I added stealing to my already sordid life. But I had to know. I had to find out. Now, if ever you are to come to grips with this whole thing, it is extremely important that you learn what I learned from all these years of research, and basically it can be broken down into 3 items. First, and perhaps most important, is the fact that no one knew what caused homosexuality. There were lots of theories. Psychiatrists considered it a mental illness. Sociologists said it was the result of a dominant mother and a reticent father, or perhaps an abusive household. Religions called it the work of the devil. The more theories, the clearer it was that no one knew. No one agreed on the causes. What they did agree on, however, was that homosexuality was the lowest of the lows, the dregs of society, and that if ever the homosexual was to experience happiness, he must get over his evil ways. And the final thing I learned was that no one knew how to get over these evil ways. Again, lots of theories, but no agreement. It made sense that if no one knew what caused it, no one would know how to cure it. Let me just review for a moment. At this point, I am still a kid. I feel I am going to spend eternity in hell, and that there is no one I feel I can talk to except a priest who simply tells me to pray. In my own studies, I find that no one knows the cause, but all agree you must get over it, but can't tell you how to do that. Feeling of hopelessness? You bet. Outwardly, I was a happy-go-lucky kid. Inwardly, I contemplated suicide. I tell you this not in order to seek sympathy, but merely as a recital of facts of my growing up. Years pass. I continue to pray. I continue to study. But one other thing happens, and that is that I continue to meet other gay people. And as if things weren't confusing enough, without a single exception, the people I met were totally different from the people I was reading about. They were not effeminate. They didn't molest young boys. They were everything from truck drivers and construction workers to teachers and corporate executives. Many were married and some had children. Their backgrounds were varied, but none of them met the profile I read about, and I certainly didn't match it either. There was something very wrong here, but I just didn't understand. More years pass, and finally, I enter Notre Dame. I am entering perhaps one of the finest Catholic universities in the country. I'm no longer dealing with some local priest, but priests with doctorates in psychology, sociology, religion. There are counselors to talk to. There is the Grotto and Sacred Heart to pray, and one of the largest college libraries in the country. Talk about the old college try. I am determined, once and for all, I am going to get over this thing. I go to Mass and receive Holy Communion every single day. I pray, I talk, I study. In fact, I spend so much time trying to figure out this whole thing that my freshman year, I flunk calculus and withdraw from physics, thereby destroying the possibility of becoming what I most wanted to be, an architect. But nothing changes. I still am told God will answer your prayers. By this time, I had been praying for more than half my life for only one thing. And where had it gotten me? I had contemplated suicide. I had destroyed my hopes of architecture. I learned to hate myself and the world around me, which expected me to be something I wasn't. And worst of all, I was now starting to hate God himself for never answering my prayers. The anger in me had swollen out of all proportion. At the end of that freshman year, before leaving Notre Dame for summer vacation, I went to Sacred Heart Church determined to have a knockdown, drag-out battle with God. I was so angry. Well, it was the shortest battle in history. For when I looked up at that altar, I vented the anger that had been building for so many years. And I said to God, "What the hell do you want from me?" And it dawned on me, no wonder God had never answered. All those years, I had been telling God what I wanted. Never once had I asked what he wanted. I did not choose to be gay. In fact, I fought it every step of the way. Now, however, I realized that if ever I was to experience any peace and happiness, I needed to accept myself as I was and to get on with my life. God had answered my prayers. Not perhaps the answer I was looking for, or that my parents would have wanted.
or that society demanded, but he had answered. I left that church happier than I had been in a decade. Not happy that I was gay, but happy that I could get on with my life, and happy that although coming to terms with my sexuality had nearly consumed me for half my life, that it was, in actuality, only a small part of being me. The anger was gone, and I finally realized I wasn't such a bad kid after all. To this day, I have absolutely no idea why I am gay, but my acceptance of it is something I have never regretted. In fact, those troubled years taught me some of the lessons I hold most dear. Things like taking nothing for granted and appreciating every day and every flower. They taught me most of all to never judge another. Folks, don't ever feel sorry for me. The joy I have experienced since my acceptance and the life I have led since far outweighs the troubles I had in my youth. And more importantly, don't ever blame yourselves for something you should have done or could have done. In fact, pat yourselves on the back for somehow giving me the strength to work through my problems. If you want to feel sorrow, feel sorry for the teens and young adults now going through what I went through. And feel sorry for the parents who must endure the suicide of what they thought was a happy child, and who will never know the reason for that death. For me, if I were to die tomorrow, I would be unequivocally happy for the wonderful life I have led. I have no regrets for you. If ever you are to come to terms with this thing, what you must first remember is that I am the same kid now that you know about me as I was before you knew. The only thing different is now I am honest. Since having accepted myself, being gay has never been a problem for me, but being dishonest and living a lie had been extremely difficult. More importantly, although I feel we have always had a good relationship, it has necessarily been an arm's length relationship because I was always hiding. I don't want an arm's length relationship with my family. I want more. Am I wrong to think you would want the same? Lastly, again, let me emphasize that never are you to blame yourselves for any of this. There is absolutely nothing you should have done or could have done to have made me otherwise. Sexuality is not a matter of choice, and as more and more research is being done, that fact is becoming more apparent. Psychiatrists have removed homosexuality from its list of mental illness. Biologists are finding possible genetic reasons for its existence. And sociologists are now saying that acceptance is the only way to go. That was something I had to find out on my own through a long and difficult struggle. My wish now is that this lengthy epistle does as much as possible to alleviate the hurt that so often accompanies one's coming out. There is nothing I want more than an open, honest relationship with my family, and nothing I would want less than to hurt the parents I love so very much. So, excuse me. You may wonder, what was the reaction of my parents? Actually, it was quite different from what I expected. My dad, who had been a homophobe my entire life, was so accepting. He couldn't have been more wonderful. The first thing he asked was, can I go have lunch with Bruce? Bruce being my partner. What a wonderful thing to ask. As a result of my coming out to my dad, we established a bond that had not existed for the first 50 years of my life. We grew together and in love and respect that was phenomenal. My mom broke down in tears. And remained in tears for 2 weeks. I never found out why she was crying. Maybe I should have asked, but I figured it was her duty to tell me, not for me to ask. So, my dad lived on to age 90, and we had a most wonderful relationship. Mom made it to 99, and we remained close, and I still loved her, but there was still that arm's length relationship. And why was that? I don't know. Was it the religion? I don't know. Anyway, on that happy note, time to return to the rest of my writings. Thank you for listening.
Good morning once again. Welcome back. Chapter 24, The Pledge of Allegiance. The original and official Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy and served our country well for 62 years. I can remember as a small schoolboy standing beside my desk, facing the flag, hand over heart, and feeling a conviction so overwhelming as to bring moisture to my eyes. To recite that pledge while standing and feeling part of the greatest country on earth was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Then, in 1954, that incredible feeling died. In June of that year, a bunch of do-gooder Christians decided their way was the right way, and that we should therefore all think that way. So, under God was added to the pledge. I don't even know what God they were referring to. The God of Abraham? The Christian God? Perhaps Allah? My friends, we are better than that. We are not a nation under God. We are a nation which allows us to be under God if that is our choice. We are not a nation which has God crammed down our throats.
I want that little schoolboy back again. I want that same feeling of conviction back again. With under God in the pledge, I cannot do that. I am agnostic. I neither believe nor disbelieve in the existence of God. But to say that I believe when I do not is to break the commandment, not bearing false witness, in which I believe most strongly. I cannot therefore recite the pledge, though my love for country has never wavered. Perhaps this is a good moment to employ the importance of separation of church and state. War. Preemptive war is wrong, always. It is wrong from the moral standpoint and wrong from the practical standpoint. The obvious upside of this thinking is that if all nations thought along these lines, there would never be another war. But since we can presume this is not going to happen, we need to address the practical side. Where does preemptive war get us? First, it destroys our economy. Instead of pouring money into defense and infrastructure, and thus putting people to work, building our economy and our lives, we send our young men to their deaths, destroying other people's lives, weakening our economy, and thereby making us more vulnerable to the very attack we are trying to avoid. What better time for an enemy to attack than when we are already down? What better defense is there than being so strong that no one dare to attack? What better way of securing allies than being so strong everyone wants to be our friends? Secondly, what does preemptive war do to our detractors and even to our allies? Instead of looking to America with hope as a nation so wealthy we can afford to help those in need around the world, they start to look on us as an aggressor, a nation to be feared, a nation that can only be brought to its knees through terrorism, the very thing we're wanting to avoid. What happened to the America that was so loved? What happened to the America that was so strong financially, so powerful militarily, and yet so caring? It is gone. It needs to return. We need to bring our men home and put them to work developing technology so superior that should we ever be attacked, we can respond in a way never before seen. Future wars will not be won on the battleground. They will be won with technology. If we go on fighting preemptive wars, we shall never have the finances necessary to develop the technology which will make the necessity of war irrelevant. Chapter 26, Experimenting. I am gay. I have known I was gay from my very first sexual experience when I was only 9 years old. This is not the norm, but it does happen. And it did not happen with some disturbed predator taking advantage of me in some dark corner. It occurred with my brother, who was 4 years older, and it was simply a question of boys doing what boys do. What was unusual for me was that I knew immediately that this was wrong, according to society, according to my parents, the local priest, and most importantly, the almighty and infallible Catholic Church. Call me precocious if you like, but that is just how it was. As mentioned, I knew homosexuality was wrong according to society, parents, and priests. But none of that mattered, as in my own mind, it felt very natural. What did bother me was I knew it was wrong according to the Catholic Church, which, as we all know, is infallible. I had learned the 10 Commandments. There was also the sin which dare not speak its name. That's what it was referred to back then. In other words, I felt I practiced a sin worse than all the rest. I truly thought it would be easier to tell my folks I had just murdered my brother than to tell them I had had sex with him. I was certain that I would burn in the everlasting fire. Do you have any idea how terrifying this idea is to a child? But that was what I was told, and told to me by grown-ups, priests, people I respected. Outwardly, I was a happy-go-lucky kid. Inwardly, I contemplated suicide. Not looking for sympathy here, for luckily, one group of people came to my rescue. Yes, it was pedophiles who saved my life. They were the only ones who told me it was okay to be me. Those pedophiles were businessmen, farmers, teachers, priests, fathers, and husbands. They were good people. And let me add that none of those pedophiles, and there were plenty of them, ever forced me to do anything I did not want to do. Chapter 27, Truth. It has been said, the truth shall set you free, and yet we deliberately shackle ourselves with religion, claiming to know the truth when actually are simply deceiving ourselves. Our forefathers fought for the freedom we have in this incredible country. If there is a God, that God has been around for eternity, and yet man has never been able to come up with an agreed conclusion about just what that God is, and regardless of this fact, insists through faith that their faith is the true faith. Hooray for agnosticism. Chapter 28, Discrimination. Discrimination in any form is loathsome, and as a gay man who has experienced plenty of it, I feel I should be able to speak out on a current injustice with impunity. The news is full of a whole new term known as systemic racism. Not I, nor any of my friends, or any member of my family, has the least bit of prejudice against blacks. However, by referring to systemic racism, you are including all of the above, and the vast majority of intelligent people into a category to which they do not belong. Furthermore, you are showing your own prejudice by including those who are not prejudiced in with the individuals who are, and I do not appreciate that. Also, by asserting that all police are biased, you further display your own prejudice. No question, there is way too much discrimination going on, but to categorize all the same is despicable. I want to believe that the majority of police are good people. Those who are not need to pay severely. But by defunding all police because of the few, you are interfering with my right to have protection under the law. You are interrupting the flow of good, non-judgmental police into the force. I will not pass judgment as to whether the blacks or the media are most at fault for this movement. But I do know that should it continue, there is a good chance that systemic racism will become reality.
Well, enough of hearing about me. I'd like to read some quotes that I have acquired over the years. I just love some of these, so I'd like to share them with you. When your work speaks for itself, don't interrupt. Henry J. Kaiser. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. Rick Warren. One cannot and must not try to erase the past merely because it does not fit the present. Golda Meir. If people are good only because they fear punishment and hope for reward, then we are a sorry lot indeed. Albert Einstein. By 3 methods we may learn wisdom. First, by reflection, which is the noblest. Second, by imitation, which is the easiest. And third, by experience, which is bitter than sweet. Confucius. If we open a quarrel between past and present, we shall find that we have lost the future. Winston Churchill. Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Martin Luther King, Jr. A raised voice never solved a problem. It merely turns a discussion into an argument, thereby negating the reason for the discussion. That's unknown. To keep the body in good health is a duty. Otherwise, we shall not be able to keep our minds strong and clear. Buddha. Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you'd have a good people doing good things and evil people doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, it takes religion. Steven Weinberg. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. Abraham Lincoln. Life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away. Maya Angelou. If you don't love someone enough to let them go, then you don't love them enough. Van Stewart. There are 3 kinds of men. The one that learns by reading, the few who learn by observation, the rest of them have to pee on the electric fence for themselves. Will Rogers. The only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. Helen Keller. All things are subject to interpretation. Whichever interpretation prevails at a given time is a function of power and not truth. Friedrich Nietzsche. Stay away from negative people. They have a problem for every solution. Albert Einstein. Heterosexuality is not normal. It's just more common. Dorothy Parker. The worst thing that happens to you may be the best thing for you if you don't let it get the best of you. Will Rogers. Though we travel the world over to find the beautiful, we must carry it with us, or we find it not. Ralph Waldo Emerson. The smallest act of kindness is worth more than the grandest intention. Oscar Wilde. I have noticed that even people who claim everything is predetermined and that we can do nothing to change it, look before they cross the street.
That's Stephen Hawking. If your glass is half empty, pour it into a smaller glass and stop bitching. Unknown. I have nothing against cell phones. It's the demise of civilization I can't stand. Van Stewart. Love is innate. Hatred is taught. Unknown. Thank you. Epilogue. My detractors can spend all the time they like pointing out the inaccuracies in my writings. I am sure there are many. But it is those who dwell in these negatives trying to find fault and continue to hold on to their faith-based lack of openness and receptiveness rather than the use the brain their supposed God has given them that I dismiss as hopeless. They have missed the point of these ramblings. But to those who would argue with the common sense presented in these writings, I look forward to positive and constructive dialogue. Do keep in mind that in no way do I dismiss the possibility of God. I only dismiss the faith which separates us so deeply from our fellow man and prevents us from even the possibility of knowing God or what he expects of us. Only when we can look at the beliefs of our fellow man with the same fervor that we look at our own will we grow together with the respect and love that I believe we all deserve.
Conclusion. I hardly know where to begin. Condensing 40 years of thoughts into a few conclusive paragraphs is daunting. But I want to get it right in order to pass those thoughts on with at least self-affirmed accuracy. Perhaps since religion, and in particular Catholicism, has most impacted my life, I shall start there. I have nothing whatever against Catholics. It's only Catholicism I cannot abide. The doctrine of infallibility is used to control its members. How can anyone believe that a church which, for decades, perhaps hundreds of years, has pushed pedophilia under the rug is an organization which should tell someone how to run his life? How can a church today have the nerve to tell women they are not fit to be priests? How can a church preach infallibility when it didn't even come into church teaching until 1870? How can a church tell a young child that he will burn in the everlasting fire if he does the, quote, sin which dare not speak its name? How can a young man who has received a calling from God to become a priest be turned away by man because he is gay? Yes, that is the Catholic Church's latest means to reduce homosexuality in the church. And how does the church do all this? By teaching that faith is the ultimate goal. My dear readers, faith is what keeps people from using the brain which God gave them. It is not the Middle Ages. It is okay to think for yourself and not be intimidated into thinking that you will burn in hell if you don't believe everything the church has to say. The day I left the Catholic Church was the first day I had truly seen the sun in years. The feeling of freedom was overwhelming. Agnosticism allows you to think. It allows you to accept the fact that you don't know. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, not knowing is very humbling. How great if more of us were more humble. The other extreme, atheism, is just as foolish. Atheists do not know there isn't a God any more than I knew
as a child that there was one. Next, about the presidency. Only in the last few elections have I heard, "He is not my president, I didn't vote for him." I don't care how much you disagree with the choice. He or she is your president for 4 years. Stand behind the people's choice, and if dissatisfied, work towards changing the result in future elections. Anything else is simply un-American. The Pledge of Allegiance. I believe this to be one of the most important issues in my writings because adding "under God" to the pledge was the start of the nation having excess control in our lives. We are not a nation under God. We are better than that. We are a nation which allows us to live under God if that is our choice. The fate of separation of church and state is at stake here, and that is not acceptable. Abortion? I am vehemently against it, but I do also believe in a woman's right to choose. I am so very thankful that I will never have to make that decision. But this fact should serve to further emphasize the importance of separation of church and state. If we are to have "under God" in our Pledge of Allegiance, then we cannot allow abortion, since the 10 Commandments clearly commands, "Thou shalt not kill." You can't have it both ways. Birthdays. By making birthdays the day a child thanks his mom for her unlimited gifts, rather than expecting through entitlement to receive gifts himself, we return to an era when a child is taught love and respect rather than entitlement. How wonderful is that? Cannibalism. Just get your own house in order and then mind your own business. God, Christ, the Bible, religion. Just feel free to think outside the box. It's okay. I am not trying to dismiss religion. Where religion brings us together, for instance, in baptisms, communions, bar mitzvahs, and marriages, they are great institutions supporting wonderful traditions. But when they separate us from one another, it is so unfortunate. War. Preemptive war is wrong. I am not a pacifist. I believe we must be so strong militarily and economically that everyone wants to be our ally and no one dare destroy us. That way we can continue to be the greatest country on earth. But while being that great country, we must be certain to not side with another country simply because of our own gain. We must be certain that allies want to join us because of kindness and not intimidation. I could go on, but even conclusions need conclusion. I would, however, like to leave you with one question totally unresolved in my own mind, but one that I believe is of incredible importance. There is much talk right now about voter fraud and access to voting and so on, and these are important questions and need to be resolved. But there is one far more important question. The reason it is so important is because without resolve, it diminishes the importance of one citizen, one vote. Donald Trump wants you to believe he lost the election due to voter fraud. This may or may not be true, and we may never know. But in my opinion, Donald Trump lost the election because he did not have media support.
What I am saying here is that your one vote and mine is no longer of any value. What is important is what the media thinks. They control the election, not you or me. I am strongly in favor of free speech, and I admit I love to listen to the media. But the media on both sides is biased. I long for a channel which simply presents the news and does fact-checking, but gives no opinion of their own. I know of no other way of returning to the importance of an individual's vote. Any input? I would relish it. Lastly, a summary of the summary. Please use your God-given brain to think for yourselves and not be intimidated by doing so. Make birthdays a fine and loving learning experience instead of one which teaches children entitlement. Lastly, get rid of under God from our pledge of allegiance, as it does not allow us to be the free people that we have the right to be. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful life. Good morning. Another beautiful day. I imagine you thought when I read my conclusions to my writings that you were through with me. No such luck. I realized that there's one subject, and it's part of my title, that I never addressed. And that is about the filthy rich. You know, I'm tired of Congress thinking that the solution to all its problems is to tax the rich. Let me mention, for instance, about Jeff Bezos, arguably one of the wealthiest people in America. Bezos hires almost 1 million Americans. Think of how much taxation he generates. Take Bill Gates, for instance. Bill Gates hires 1,700 people just to take care of giving away his money. Bill Gates so far has given away $60 billion. And why do we vilify the rich? Here's a better idea. How about if Congress invites these super wealthy people to come to Congress and help them understand economics, because they certainly don't. The other subject that I wish to get into a bit more deeply is that of agnosticism. Agnosticism is not a 4-letter word. In fact, it's a word that has to do with truth. You know, back in the day when I was a staunch Catholic, I actually felt sorry for people who did not believe the same way that I did. How sad is that? You know, we are taught religion when we are the youngest, the most impressionable. Well, heck, I learned about Santa Claus at that time, and I believed all of that as well. But when we are taught religion at that impressionable age, and then are taught infallibility and just believe, well, that's what we do. We stop thinking. We must not stop thinking. So when I went myself from staunch Catholic to agnostic, what happened was I became a lot more humble. it's very humbling to realize that you don't know. And how much better it would be if we were all a bit more humble. So, thank you for listening to me. I much appreciate it. And I wish you a good day and a wonderful life.